Greetings and welcome to the latest event in the Business Matters webinar series from Geese College of Business. I'm Amanda Brantner, Senior Associate Director with Geese College of Business at the University of Illinois, and I look forward to spending the next hour with each of you. Our faculty experts have developed this series of webinars to address some of the pressing issues businesses face today, from the economic impact of COVID-19 to cybersecurity and ethics. These webinars enable you to be better prepared to succeed and thrive through any number of challenges. Before we get started with managing remote work relationships with Professor Judith White, I want to cover a few housekeeping items related to our Q&A portion. Please submit all of your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. Your questions will be submitted publicly for our entire audience to see. In order to develop consensus around our questions, please use upvoting. The upvote thumb will be located next to the question in the Q&A window. I look forward to bringing the top questions to Professor White following her presentation. Any general housekeeping questions can be answered in text by the Geese team working in the background. It's now my privilege to introduce today's presenter, Judith White. Professor White teaches courses in negotiation and management here at the University of Illinois. Her research and teaching specializes in negotiation, organizational behavior, and conflict resolution. Her research on these subjects has been published in some of the top journals in psychology. She is one of the nation's top experts on today's topic, and so I hope you're as excited as I am to learn from her today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judith White.
Hi, thank you, Amanda, very much. I'm happy to be here today. All right, thank you. I'm sorry that I can't have my camera on while I talk to you, but Thomas, let me know anytime during the webinar the situation improves and I can turn it on.
Yeah, no problem. We're still getting red bars on your end. So let's proceed like this for now.
Okay. I want to thank you for registering for today's webinar and to point out that this presentation, meaning the slides and the webinar itself, is protected by copyright. But most of the information I'm bringing to the table today originates in the rich academic literature on these topics, and I encourage you to freely share these ideas with your colleagues. So I want to start by pointing out that remote employees are more likely than their managers to say they are struggling. This is the results of a survey that Microsoft commissioned from the Edelman Data and Intelligence Company. They surveyed over 31,000 remote workers. And as you can see on the left here, managers, almost 2/3 of them, but certainly more than half, reported that they were actually thriving doing remote work. But everybody else, more than half of them said they were either surviving or actually struggling. The struggle is real, people, and it affects all of us. Even if we're individually thriving, I guarantee you there's someone in your team or your office who's struggling right now with remote work. So part of the struggle, no doubt, is due to problems accessing the technology like we're having right now, the internet, or distractions in what passes for a home office, right? There's things going on in the background, but those are stressors we can't do much about. What we can do is focus on the things that will help us to overcome those stressors and help us to stop struggling, just surviving, and maybe move to thriving. And the key among those things that we can do is to form and maintain positive work relationships. These are key to our ability to work together to achieve organizational goals. In this webinar, I'm going to show you why this is the case. Then I will discuss 3 aspects of positive work relationships that are negatively affected by remote work and offer suggestions to improve them. So let's start by pointing out there's no question that individuals benefit from positive work relationships. Take a look at the benefits that are listed here on this slide. For example, having positive work relationships is likely to bring task assistance, emotional support, and friendship, and no less important, gives us the opportunity to help others It's related to personal growth, and research even shows that when we have positive work relationships, it's actually tied to career advancement. And if all that is true, then you won't be surprised that positive work relationships ultimately translate into greater job satisfaction. They give us more meaning in the work we do, which means we can be more motivated. Gives us positive affect because we're in a good mood, because that's what positive relationships do, and overall helps us with life satisfaction. Now, one reason people are struggling with remote work is because they feel they can't adequately maintain their positive work relationships. The positive work relationships themselves could buffer those stressors, the poor Wi-Fi, the lack of camera that I have right now, time zone snafus, the tech struggles, the inadequate home offices, distractions, etc. We need these relationships. They're important. They matter. They're not extras. And organizations benefit from these relationships too. So the research shows us that when employees have positive relationships with each other, there's more trust between them. This increases knowledge transfer and ultimately innovation, because people are talking about projects they're not necessarily working on together. They're having casual conversations with their friends and people they know, maybe outside their team or unit. And these positive relationships also help with conflict resolution. It's much easier to have a difficult conversation with someone you know isn't going to reject you than someone you don't know well. At the same time, these positive work relationships are shown to reduce turnover. For example, people who have a lot of friends at work are less likely to quit their jobs. It's even been linked to lower levels of deviant behavior. By that, I mean people who are calling in sick, or a lot of absenteeism, even theft or incivility. Having a lot of positive relationships at work can cut down on these behaviors as well. So the benefits of positive work relationships accrue to the organization, not just to individuals. And of course, teams benefit especially from these positive work relationships. When you're mutually dependent on others to accomplish a shared goal, having those positive relationships that bring trust, task assistance, support, the opportunity to help each other, that's not just an added value, it can feel practically necessary. So the thing is, we humans are social animals. We naturally form relationships and join groups. It's not second nature, it's actually our primary nature to do this. But the way we form these relationships has evolved over time and is very dependent on things like physical proximity and frequency of exposure, living under shared circumstances, how often we see people, and we don't have these cues and same ways of knowing each other when we're working remotely. For example, we know, and this is true, you're more likely to be friends with your neighbors than you are with a random family across town. You're more likely to form work relationships with people you see frequently if their offices are next to yours, even if you just share an elevator. So anyone who's been working from home, who has kids who've been learning from home, knows how different that environment is from the office or the classroom. And no, we can't replicate the office with Microsoft Teams for remote workers. And besides, you really want to run into your colleague the next time you get up to use the bathroom at home. But before you think, it's not possible to have the same kinds of relationships with people when we're working remotely as when we're working face-to-face. Let me remind you that it is most definitely possible. Positive online relationships are nothing new. People form them in multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft, for example. They form them on social media like Facebook. And of course, people form positive relationships on dating sites like eHarmony. And before you say, wait a minute, those relationships are social relationships, they're not work relationships. That is a good point. These are not the same. And we should emphasize this before we go any further. Although I will say that in World of Warcraft, a friend of mine actually met her husband on World of Warcraft. They formed a positive work relationship because they were part of a group, they had shared goals, they cooperated, and they helped each other achieve them. At any rate, we do need to distinguish between regular friendships and work friendships. So the characteristics of a positive work relationship. Here's the thing, people tend to think it's like a regular friendship. We like each other. In fact, we would be friends outside work. And that's really nice. In fact, that can be part of a positive work relationship. But work, after all, is about getting things done. And so we have to add some very specific characteristics to turn a positive relationship to a positive work relationship. So what actually matters are, we trust each other, we help each other, and we can confidently resolve conflict. So these are the three things I'm going to talk about, how each of them has been affected by remote work, and maybe what are the little things that we can do to overcome these obstacles. So let's first take a look at trust. We trust each other. Well, turns out we don't actually trust each other. These data are from a 2018 Pew Research report. They found that about half of Americans are not sure that they can trust each other. 47% said on average that most people can't be trusted. 58% said people will try to take advantage of you. And 62% said people are generally just looking out for themselves. And it gets worse. The younger people are, the less trusting they are. So that means that among your new hires, adults 18 to 29, only about 1 in 10 in this survey said they trusted easily. But trust is so important at work. But we are starting from a position of low trust. So we will have to build it. So let's first talk about what we mean by trust at work. So although the lay definition of trust is often conflated with having faith in someone or something, well, I believe in this person, or I believe in something. In truth, in work, the operational definition is the willingness to be vulnerable. In fact, the willingness to put something you value at risk, choosing to be vulnerable to another person's actions based on your positive expectations of them. In other words, like this little scenario, we have on the left-hand side, the trustee, that's the person who receives trust, saying, don't worry, you can go home, I'll finish the report. And then the person on the right in this slide is the trustor, the person who is giving trust, who says, great, see you later, knowing perfectly well that if the trustee doesn't stay late and finish the report, it's going to hurt the trustor. But if there's trust, then it enables the trustor to go ahead and leave early. This is the same thing essentially as giving someone power over you, right? Allowing yourself to be vulnerable to them. And so it's not a surprise that people are not that quick to trust or not that likely to trust. Yet, trust at work translates to value for the organization. In Joel Peterson's book, he writes, trust reduces the transaction costs, therefore it makes work more efficient. We don't have to worry that somebody's going to do what they said they would do, or check up on them, or that they did a good job. We trust them, so it's done. At the same time, trust improves communication, cooperation, and coordination. That increases effectiveness. He says, here's an example that Peterson gives in his book. He says, things go faster when you have a high trust culture. You don't have to enforce things. You don't have to double check. You don't have to he was talking about real estate lawyers involved. He said, I remember doing a deal with a lender in the real estate business. He was completely flexible. He didn't have to look back at the documents. He said, let's solve this. And we were able to solve it quickly and smoothly. Why? Because we trusted each other. So there are, in fact, 4 ways that we trust each other. And I'm going to talk about how each of these is affected by remote work. So at the lower left of this slide, you see, I'm a trusting person. One reason that we trust people is because we just tend to be trusting people. It's part of our nature, our disposition, it says here. So that just means that I generally trust people. Now, if you'll recall, most people in the United States don't generally trust people. And not only that, but this isn't going to change with remote work, right? I am who I am. My nature is not going to change. So I'm going to set that aside and not say more about it. At the same time, the one on the far right, which says you have to obey, some people wouldn't even call this trust. But the truth is, if I can monitor you and I can sanction you if you don't do what you said you were going to do, then I can, and I'm making air quotes here, trust you, because I know I won't be hurt. In the United States, we have a lot of enforcement mechanisms. We have contract law. That enables us to, again, air quotes, trust somebody, because we're able to say, I don't know this person. I'm not sure they're going to do what they say they're going to do, but I can always sue them if they don't. So if I'm able to monitor and control someone, then I can trust them. And this probably has changed with remote work, but particularly the way that it has changed is that managers no longer have the ability to monitor, and some of them don't have the ability to force people to comply. And so actually their trust in their remote employees has gone down. But I'm not going to talk about that today either, because monitoring people and sanctioning or punishing them, not foundational to forming a positive work relationship. It's It's not going to build trust. It's not going to lead to innovation. So I'm going to set that one aside as well. Instead, I want to focus on the top two: cognition-based trust, which is I know this person, I know what they're going to do, and affect-based trust. I know this person and I like them, therefore I trust them. Both of these things, cognition-based trust and affect-based trust, come up out of our knowledge of the other person, what we think of them and how we feel about them. And this is really important because, as you know, when we're working from home, we don't have the same opportunities to get to know people in the same way. So let me say one thing about each of these kinds of trust. The first is cognition-based trust. And yes, this is a quote from Captain Jack Sparrow. Me, I'm dishonest. And a dishonest man you can always trust to be dishonest. And in fact, in the movie, the other characters do trust Captain Jack Sparrow at least a little bit because they know him and they can predict what he's going to do. In other words, if I know what you're going to do, then I feel comfortable trusting you, right? That really goes a long way. So cognition-based trust is all about what I know about you. Are you predictable? Can I understand how you see things and predict how you're going to behave? I need to know a lot about you. Affect-based trust. So this is based on knowing and liking a person. A blogger who goes by bio is not alone in his love of Oprah Winfrey. She's one of the most beloved celebrities in the world. People trust her, even though they don't know her personally. They don't know the details of her life or how she interacts with her employees, but they trust her because they like her. And because they trust her, they accept influence from her. Sometimes we know that we like people because we see them often. Again, we don't always have that in remote work. So one of the problems with remote work is it truly, truly impedes trust development because it prevents us from getting to know our colleagues and prevents us from finding out that we like our colleagues. We're basically deprived of a huge source of intelligence. Think about it. We are social creatures. We can sit in a meeting, like on the left of this slide, and we get a whole lot of information about the other people at the table, and it all comes automatically. How close is this person? How strong or large is this person? How friendly is this person? What's this person's mood? Are they excited? Are they upset? What do I think this person's going to do? And I don't even have to work hard to get that information. I process that automatically. That's natural. I need to be able to predict the behavior of people around me. And at the same time, the casual encounters we have before meetings, after meetings, in the hallway, in the aforementioned shared bathroom or the kitchen facilities, in the parking lot, enable us to see another side of our colleagues. We can see them interact with others. We can see them repeatedly in casual conversation that has nothing to do with work. And those sources of intel, that huge stream that we generally build on every day, we don't have that when we work remotely. Instead, as the image on the right suggests, we're basically seeing our colleagues kind of through a straw. If face-to-face communication when we're sitting in the same room is very rich because we can see a lot of people's nonverbal behavior and we can see how they're reacting to something. Are they leaning forward eagerly? Are they shuffling their feet because they're anxious about something? When we sit in a Zoom meeting, one of the reasons we have Zoom fatigue is because we have to sit in the same position and look, hopefully, into the camera. We can't get up and pace around the room. We can't turn our body toward the person who's speaking. So it's physically tiring as well. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that that huge river of information that we get when we're interacting face-to-face in the workplace is shrinking to a tiny trickle of information. And we're kind of sucking at it through a straw because it's very difficult to pay attention in a Zoom meeting. I don't have to tell you that. The temptation to multitask is really huge, especially if you know the meeting's being recorded and you go back and check in on it later. So we're sending all of our cognitive effort trying to pay attention in a meeting, and we're not getting all of the easily digestible social information about people. So that's why remote work impedes trust development. It's cutting down on the amount of information we have about our colleagues, and it's making the information we do get really expensive in terms of our time and attention. And I'm afraid that is a cost that we probably should be willing to bear because this information is valuable. So here are some things that you can do to help others learn to trust you in this environment. One thing is to improve cognition-based trust. You want people to get to know you And if they can't get to know you, at least you want to be predictable. So if it's a large group meeting, you want to make sure that you are predictable. You might even say consistent, except some of us are consistently inconsistent. Your visual appearance should be predictable. Your communication style should be predictable. And most important, your communication response latency has to be predictable. If you normally answer messages in a certain period of time, anytime you do something differently, you need to explain yourself, because otherwise people are going to get the wrong impression. So you want to be predictable. And if you can't be predictable, then you want to give an explanation. And the other thing that we can do in order to increase affect-based trust, which is people like us, is remember why people like us. It's actually very simple. Familiarity breeds liking. People that we see a lot are people we tend to like. So you're going to have to share some information about yourself, and you're going to have to show up for things, put your camera on, things like that. And similarity also leads to liking. When we know somebody is in the same situation we are, or went to the same school we do, or they're in the same, they have the same constraints we do, or the same problems, well, then we feel that we share a fate. And that is a very deep psychologically rooted need to be in a group with people that we feel we share a fate with. And so we're more likely to like them. So we can do that remotely as well by sharing a little bit of information. We can take time to schmooze, right? You know what schmoozing is. My colleague, Mark Mortensen, suggests saying, tell me something about where you're located. Catch me up on one of your projects, or even, how about those Illini? At the beginning of my Zoom classes, I always do a check-in question where people can just say whatever they want. What superpower would you like to have? What was the last meal you ate? Anything like that. The only problem with this type of schmoozing is that not everybody is comfortable doing it in a large group. Introverts especially are much more comfortable with one-on-ones. The technology doesn't really allow us in video conferencing to have these kinds of schmoozing, but some of the other apps that we use, like Slack and Teams, and I don't even know the names of all of them, they do enable people to interact one-on-one. And I strongly encourage you to do that. Reach out to people on a regular basis and just chat with them in order to, and this is the reason you're doing it, allow yourselves to build trust in one another, and therefore to build positive work relationships. Consistent with that, let's all reach out to new hires. And the new hires should reach out, of course, to the people in their team. But everybody needs, just as you would walk somebody around the office in the old days, this time everybody needs to reach out via chat, for example, or video, just to introduce themselves, share what they're working on, share one thing people wish they had told you when you first started, and then ask the new hires about themselves. I would say that the closest 7 to 10 people to the new hire should do this, and to do it consistently, not just once, but every week. So that's how important trust is in a relationship, and how working remotely really makes it difficult to form trusting relationships with our colleagues. Some of the extra effort that we can do in order to overcome those obstacles. Let's talk about the second one. And that is, let's talk about the second one. We help each other. This is absolutely critical, of course, to positive work relationships. We help each other. After all, work is about getting things done. And work relationships is about getting things done together. So we want to help each other. And I want to start by giving a shout out to my wonderful colleague, Adam Grant, who says, be a giver, not a taker. This is the foundation, he claims, to forming positive relationships at work. And I completely trust him when he says this. It can be big things that you're offering to do for somebody. It can be little things that you're offering to do for something. Little acts of kindness, empathy, and inclusion go a long way and even tend to be reciprocated. But not only do we want to give help whenever we can, even if it's something small, we also want to be able to ask for help. And that's something that we all struggle to do, I think. So I'm going to tell you a little story here. In 1978, a United Airlines flight crashed because it ran out of fuel, even though the flight engineer tried repeatedly to warn the pilot that they were going to run out of fuel. What happened to this plane is they had some trouble with their landing gear, and the captain was very focused on trying to figure out if the landing gear was safe to land. But even after he determined it was, he still held off on landing because he wanted to check a whole bunch of other things, and he basically didn't feel any pressure. We would call that a lack of situational awareness. Meanwhile, the flight engineer is trying to communicate to the pilot, you don't have enough fuel to keep circling. They actually circled for an hour and 5 minutes, longer than they were supposed to. Then they ran out of fuel. The flight engineer tried repeatedly to bring this information to the captain's attention and failed. And ultimately, the plane crashed. Now, if these two people with similar training and a shared culture and clearly defined roles sitting in the same cockpit can have communication problems, then I think we're all in a lot of trouble, folks, because we don't sit in the same cockpit. We don't necessarily have the same training. Hopefully we have clear roles and a shared culture, but those are very important. So one of the things we know about communicating, and I'm going to link this to asking for help, is that we really need to train to communicate effectively. Although, again, we all grow up communicating, we all grow up talking to people, right? It's still very different from being able to do it effectively. So crew resource management is a training program that was actually created in the wake of the accident I just described and some other accidents in the 1970s in order to prevent the same kind of human error that comes from a lack of clear communication. And it basically trains pilots, and not just pilots, but also in healthcare. This is used to train people in operating theaters to get the person's attention, to state your concern, to state the problem as you see it, to offer a solution, and to obtain agreement. And people practice these 5 things in order to make sure when the stakes are high, it's life and death, that they have communicated effectively. I would wager that generally most of us, if we're not involved in life and death communication, life and death decisions and communications, we tend not to do these things. And I've got a theory as to why, and I'm going to share it with you in a little moment. But first, I just want to point out some of the problems that we know cause communication issues, even when people are in the same room, that are exacerbated when we're trying to communicate via what we call computer-mediated communication. In other words, video conferencing or text-based communication or even voice calls. First of all, every message has both a sender and a receiver, right? So the sender, like in the example I just told you about, would be the flight engineer. The sender says, I think we're running low on fuel here, but the sender hasn't really established a frame of reference. And this matters because, or this is relevant to what we're doing because, but just kind of thrown a piece of information out there and hoped that the person on the other end will understand without being told why this is important. Second, there's often an omission of relevant information. I told them something in case they were interested, but I didn't actually give them the whole story. I will if they ask. I've done my job. Sometimes the communication isn't effective because the person is giving their opinion or they're biased. You're not going to want to hear this, but, and it's a terrible thing, but we are running out of fuel will actually diminish the impact that that communication will have. And sometimes people send mixed messages. They're unwilling to repeat themselves. They have a lack of assertiveness and they communicate with disrespect. So I don't think we made many of these mistakes in our remote work, but anytime you've seen a message pop up and you really don't know, is this information relevant to something? Is it important? Is it time sensitive? What am I supposed to do with it? Don't we kind of default to thinking, well, I'll just wait and see if it pops up again, because if it doesn't, then it probably wasn't important. Meanwhile, the person sending it really clearly intended it for it to have some impact, but didn't communicate what that impact was supposed to be. So we've got to be more intentional with the way we communicate, because even when people have shared training and they're physically in the same place and it's a life or death situation, they can sometimes fail to communicate effectively. So if that's the case, then we're going to find it much harder. At the same time, people who are listening, so they're on the receiving end of the message, well, we make mistakes as well. We tend to listen with our mind already made up, so we're not actually listening. We're just waiting to speak. we're not actively listening. Boy, oh boy, these Zoom meetings are really difficult to focus on. It's hard not to multitask. And if in fact we're at home, even if we're not in a meeting, but we've got all those windows open, there's so many distractions. We may not really actively be paying attention. It has less importance when it is at a distance. Someone shouting in your ear versus someone shouting from down the block means two very different things. So it's hard to really get the same level of, oh, I need to pay attention to that. We've got to put more effort into it. The other thing that people tend to do is they think ahead of the sender and cutting them off. They miss nonverbal signals, which by definition is going to happen when we're working remotely. They're not asking for clarification because it slows things down, makes us feel silly. I didn't really understand what you meant by that. And of course, and once again, disrespect. So I guess that what I'm trying to say with these lists of things that can muck up our communication is you hear all the time, communicate more, you can't over communicate, just keep sending the message. But just sending the message, repeating yourself isn't necessarily going to give you effective communication. We've really got to retrain ourselves for how to do this now that we're doing it remotely. Our apps, of course, can help, but information is not the same thing as communication. Basically, that's my point. We still have to practice assertiveness. We still have to practice active listening. We still have to be effortful, slow the conversation down to make sure, did you understand what I said? Can you repeat that back to me? So we need to make ourselves very clear. We need to listen attentively. Neil Armstrong famously, when he landed on the moon, he was quoted as saying, "A small step for man, a giant step for mankind." And then he repeated until his dying day that he had actually said, "A small step for a man, a giant leap for mankind." But nobody heard him, and he didn't repeat it often enough. And if we can misunderstand Neil Armstrong when he's the first man to walk on the moon, I think we can misunderstand each other as well. So we need to make intentions very clear. In order to misunderstanding, we need to communicate frequently and proactively. As I said, it doesn't mean to repeat ourselves endlessly. We want to use clear, unambiguous language, say no more or less than needs to be said to get the message across. And this is the part we often forget. Ask to hear how the message was received. Closed loop communication means that I say something and then I hear a confirmation back, like pilots do. Flaps at 45, and then the co-pilot will repeat it. Flaps at 45 when they're doing it, so that the captain understands that the communication has been effective. We need to do the same thing. I know it's going to fill up our message boxes and inboxes and email boxes with lots of got it's and dones, but that's better than not knowing if the person got it or actually did it. So we want to ask to hear, how was the message received? What do you understand? We need to listen attentively and refine our message as necessary. So I started this section by talking about giving and helping, which is really important. We can't help if we can't communicate effectively. But what we want to do once we can communicate it effectively is, of course, to offer help. Now, I will say most of us are perfectly willing to offer help. And if someone asks us, we're willing to offer. We're not always comfortable leaning over somebody's desk, like in this picture here, and saying, "Excuse me, you seem to be having a problem. May I help you?" If you're old enough, you'll remember Clippy, the Microsoft animated icon. No one wants to be interrupted. And in fact, a lot of times we want to let people figure things out on their own. So we're very reluctant to butt in and offer to help somebody. That makes it that much more important for us to ask for help. And there are ways to ask for help that are easier to do and more effective than others. For example, one thing I would recommend is that anytime you ask for help, you orient toward shared goals. For example, I'm working on that project Marcy was talking about this morning, and I ran into a problem I'd like to ask your opinion on. Or I'm trying to set up a spreadsheet to track our inventory, but I can't figure out this Excel function. Do you know how VLOOKUP works? So I have oriented toward shared goals. We're all on the same team. I've shown respect in the way that I described the problem and asked for help. That's going to get a different response from somebody simply saying, "Do you know how VLOOKUP works?" You want to give the message in context. And we also want to signal a willingness to help. Happy to help. Let me know. Give me a shout if you need anything. That's number 2. We need to put more effort into asking for help. Not be shy to do it, not be shy, of course, to give, because positive work relationships are characterized by giving and receiving assistance to one another. And it's way too easy to sit at home and feel disconnected from the rest of the group and not want to ask for help because we don't want to lose face. I just want to remind you that people love to give help. It's one of the benefits of a positive relationship. And if you've given somebody an opportunity to help you in a way that is going to help everyone, you've done them a favor. So ask for help. And the third thing I want to talk about today is that in positive work relationships are characterized by the ability to confidently resolve conflict. And here's where I'm going to talk perhaps at length. I realize I don't have that much length left, but one of the things that happens in remote work relationships is people are very focused on being nice. I know there's such a thing as online trolls. That's when you don't have a work relationship and you don't know the other people. In truth, and this could be a Midwestern thing, in truth, people are overly nice when they're working remotely. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to get in trouble, and they don't want to offend. And so they're very, very positive with each other. I'll give you an example. I had technical issues. This is only the second time I've ever had technical issues. I had technical issues 2 weeks ago with one of my undergrad classes, and it was so bad I had to end class early. And to a student, they all logged off saying, thank you, as if I delivered the entire lecture, because they're really nice. That has been the norm of working online in my experience. But the problem with being nice is we don't want to engage in conflict. We need to engage in conflict in order to have good decisions and in order to have good outcomes. So let me say something about that. There are, in fact, 5 different approaches to conflict. And it's important to understand the different approaches because they tell us something about the underlying relationship. 5 approaches, and if you took a management course in college or even a negotiations course, you'll recognize this either as the Thomas Kilmann grid. It's also sometimes called the dual concern model. The 5 types of conflict approach are to accommodate, to collaborate, to compromise, to avoid, and to contend. So let me talk about each one of these. First, let me talk about to contend. To contend means I'm going to win this argument. Here are all my reasons. Here's why I think I'm right. Here's why I think you're wrong. That's what it sounds like to contend. To accommodate kind of sounds like the opposite. I'm willing to give you this. Okay. I'm perfectly happy for you to have it. You go ahead. You're right. I give up. I want you to be happy. That's what it sounds like to accommodate. Let me just stop for a moment and mention that we like people who accommodate us, but it's not a good long-term strategy to always accommodate. And I'll explain why in a moment. The third one is the compromise. The compromiser says, well, we can't both have what we want, so let's each give something up. Let's split this down the middle. This is a very quick and very common way that we approach conflicts. The collaborators say, let's work together to see if we can come up with a win-win. Let's problem solve this. Let's workshop this. Let's exchange a lot of information and come up with some creative proposals. And then the avoiders don't want to have the conversation at all. They're like, never mind. Well, we don't need to talk about that. I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to let it go. Now, there's a time and place for each one of these styles, obviously. I think there's a movie with Denzel Washington where he wants to get medical treatment for his wife. He's going to contend. He's going to march into that ER and he's going to say, I need this. And you need to give it to me. And I'm going to insist that you give it to me. And I don't care what you have to say. When somebody contends, they are. And now look at these orange bars on the left and the bottom of this slide. When someone contends, they are showing a high concern for their own interests. This is important to me. I care about this. I'm going to win. And now look at the left, that bar on the left, they're showing a low concern for the other person's interest. And I don't care what you think or what you want. That's what a contender is signaling when they come in and say, I'm going to win this argument. When somebody accommodates, unfortunately, what they are doing is they are signaling that their interests are not important. Oh, no, it's okay. I don't mind. Doesn't matter to me. You go ahead and do this. You have this. You take this. I have a high concern for your interests, low concern for my own interests. A moment ago, I said, maybe accommodating consistently, not a good strategy for work. And here's the reason. If we consistently signal, that we don't have a high concern for our own interests? Is it any wonder that people don't pay attention to us, don't think highly of our interests, and don't attempt to satisfy us? No, it is not. So what I have seen happen is that people who are accommodating initially are really appreciated by their colleagues. It's great when you sit down and somebody says, oh, no, we'll do it. That's fine. Yeah, you go ahead and take this. It's not a big deal to me. That is a great thing to hear. Of course, over time, there are going to be times when I say it, but I don't really mean it. And eventually I begin to resent the people who don't understand that sometimes it should be my turn. So that's why I think accommodation is great, but you shouldn't use it all the time. People who are collaborating are signaling that they have a high concern for their own interests. This is really important to me or to my team, but also a high concern for the other party's interests. But I know this is important to you too. So let's sit down and see if we can problem solve and come up with something that makes us both happy. This is signaling that I value the relationship, and I think this is important, and we're going to have to work together to find something that works for both of us. Whereas in the left-hand column down here, avoid, not having the conversation, it's okay, never mind, is signaling a low concern for my interests and a low concern for the other party's interests, and folks, a low concern for the relationship as well. So when we work remotely and something comes up that could potentially be a conflict, and we're like, I'm just not going to say anything. I'm not comfortable. It's not worth it. We'll just go ahead and do it. What we're doing is we're disengaging from the relationship when we do that. And I know we think that we are actually helping the relationship by not talking about conflict, but we are very clearly signaling that it doesn't matter. And this, I believe, is very dangerous. So one of the things that I would like us to do always in person, but also remotely, is to use conflict as a signal to exchange information. And I've got why here in a really big letter. Use conflict as a signal to exchange information. Wait a minute, can you just tell me why you think we should do it this way, or why? Very often people working together have different information about a problem, or they interpreted the information differently, or they have different stakes. There's something, they have a constraint that we didn't know about, and we want to uncover that different information. We want to uncover those different perspectives, because different information and different perspectives are going to help us make better decisions. They're going to help us avoid mistakes. They're going to help us be more innovative and creative. So I think conflict is a really good way to create value, but we have to ask why. We have to overcome our reluctance in virtual work, in remote work, when we're very worried about upsetting the other person, to actually engage with them proactively. And it's going to take time, but I want to assure you it's really, really beneficial. First of all, and we're not talking about complaining about each other, but we're talking about disagreements over a task. So we call that task conflict. And the research is very clear that moderate levels of task conflict are actually productive. Getting that additional perspective, that other information, that hidden constraint out on the table, that is very useful. Charlene Nemeth said, and I quote, "Minority views, even when they are wrong," and I want to emphasize this, "foster the kinds of attention and thought processes that on balance permit the detection of new truths and raise the quality of group decision-making and performance." In other words, best to have a discussion where we don't all agree, and then somebody makes a decision, then have somebody make a decision and then ask, is everybody in agreement? That's what I'm trying to say. And this is nothing new. Alfred Sloan, who is the CEO of General Motors a long time ago, said, "I take it we are all in complete agreement on the decision here. Then I propose we postpone further discussion of the matter until our next meeting to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what the decision is all about." So I have some suggestions for how management teams can, quote, have a good fight. I took this from an article that some colleagues of mine wrote about management teams having a good fight. How can remote teams have a good fight? Folks, we have to slow down our discussions. I know we have Zoom fatigue. We don't want to stay in these meetings, but we've got to slow down our discussions to give ourselves time to do these things. First of all, we want to establish and reinforce norms for healthy conflict. That means, for example, two things that we know are really important for that. One is making sure that everybody speaks in a team meeting. Okay, so I'm talking about about 7 people, not a meeting of 50. Make sure everybody speaks. And I have found that if everybody speaks at the beginning, they're more likely to speak later. So go around and do check-ins. You're not just schmoozing and finding out how people are doing, but you're also getting them to unmute and speak up. And then they're more likely to do that later if they have a concern. Second, make sure that everybody speaks in meetings. Go around the room, and it does take time. Seek differences in information and interpretation. Do you have some information that the rest of us that hasn't come out yet, that hasn't been shared? Is there anything, did you see something differently? Here's something I always do as well. I always ask for concerns. For example, I might say, look, looks like we're all in agreement. That's great, right? We reached consensus right away, but let's just stop for a moment and think about what it's going to look like a month from now if we go ahead and implement this, and then we have a problem that we didn't anticipate. Can we just stop for a moment and kind of brainstorm what problems we might anticipate so that we can actually anticipate them, make sure that they don't happen? That sometimes gets people feel more free to communicate concerns that they have. Another thing that is very useful is for the team leader to wait to share the opinion. This is important for preventing groupthink. If the leader of the team says, well, before we get started, I just think the best thing to do would be to have this on site. Now let's go around the room and see what everybody else thinks. Well, you can just imagine what that conversation is going to look like. Who's going to challenge the boss if it feels like the decision's already been made? So if you really want to promote a healthy norm of conflict resolution, of surfacing different opinions and concerns, wait until and give your opinion afterwards. Finally, I know people are very, very keen on trying to build cohesion in their team. Cohesion being liking everybody and wanting to be part of this team. It's a great team. I love working with this team. But what's more important is to focus on building inclusion and shared goals and let cohesion come on its own. Focus on inclusion, meaning hear from everybody, even if they're not an expert, even if they're not prepared, just have everybody speak up, and that is a norm, and be contributing something each time. And focus always on shared goals. This is work. We're here for a reason. We're trying to get stuff accomplished. The cohesion will come. So just to reiterate there, we want to establish our norms explicitly and follow them faithfully and revisit them as necessary. And the 2 chief kinds of norms that I think we need to focus on for remote work, because it's difficult to do, are norms of inclusion and norms for how we handle conflict. When we work in person, these norms, which are very naturally occurring, tell us what is okay to do and what is not okay to do. Norms are something, for example, that are fostered not just by observing other people. Is it okay to take your phone out in a meeting? Do people eat at their desks, or do they go out for lunch? Do they come in late for a meeting? Do they challenge the boss? Like, what are the norms here? We usually see those by observing people. And the other way that we find out what the norms are and how keenly they are enforced, in other words, how strong the culture is, folks, is by gossiping. And I know that gossiping has a bad name, but it turns out that gossiping evolved along with people because it enables us to figure out what are the boundaries, what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior, what are the punishments, what can you get away with? And we don't have the gossip either anymore. So if norms are not going to form on their own, and if we don't have strong norms, then we don't know what's okay, and then we're afraid to do anything. So it's important for the leaders for remote teams to establish these norms explicitly, to make sure that people follow them faithfully and revisit them as necessary. We have to say, let's use a thumbs up emoji for X, right? Let's use the chat, this chat channel for Y, both for inclusion and how we handle conflict. So what can other platforms teach us about building positive online relationships? We need to devote extra time to communicate frequently. We need to be predictable. We need to follow norms so that people will get to know us. People will trust us. We need to be positive and supportive. Absolutely. This comes from the literature on online relationships, not work relationships, but we also need to help each other achieve our goals, and we need to practice our conflict management skills. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And Amanda is now going to forward some questions.
Thank you, Judith. What a wonderful presentation, and certainly something that's helpful to me as I spend much of my time working remotely or managing teams that are working remotely. So I'm sure everyone feels similarly. We've got a number of questions and about 9 minutes left, so we'll get through a few of them. The first one is around loyalty. And so the impact that remote work has on creating loyalty with employees to the job or organization. This for me relates a little bit to trust. I'm wondering if you can comment on how one might help employees remain loyal to their job or organization while working remotely.
There's a construct that Denise Rousseau popularized called a psychological contract. It's the unspoken agreement, not the work contract, which we sign, that's a legal agreement, but the unspoken interpersonal agreement between a company and a worker. And I think loyalty comes from upholding that psychological contract. So that psychological contract, in many cases, kind of got ripped to shreds when managers sent their employees home, especially if the nature of the work and the quality of the supervision changed dramatically. If the rules changed unilaterally, then that psychological contract has been broken, and then people are not going to feel as much loyalty. So one way to maintain loyalty is to renegotiate and uphold that contract. And the things that are in that kind of contract are sort of, what is acceptable from your side? What is acceptable from my side? Is it okay for you to work asynchronously and work your own hours? Or do I still expect you to work 9 to 5 and be sitting in front of your computer all day? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer and certainly helps to think about building loyalty. It relates to some other questions we have, which are around what I think of as kind of like this digital citizenship or remote work citizenship and what that looks like, right? You talked about like the contract changing. And so some of the questions that came up are around really, specific instances of what about that manager, that micromanager who's constantly monitoring your Skype status? Or what's the expectation around having your Zoom video on or off? Right. And so wonder if you can comment on that. I think it certainly relates to the change in the contract, right? So any thoughts or responses on how one might navigate those conversations with their remote employees or potentially with their remote manager?
So first, of course, relationships are not one size fits all. They're going to differ in different industries and different companies and different units and between different people, right? So there's no one way to have a positive work relationship, but the building trust, the communication, and the conflict resolution skills are what is necessary to have that difficult conversation with one's manager. And it is a difficult conversation. If my manager's attempt to monitor me is intrusive and actually hurting my ability to work, I need to be able to have that conversation, and I need to be able to frame it in a way that shows we all want the same thing here. So shared superordinate goals, right? And I understand, maybe I don't understand why it's important that I do these things you're asking me to do. Maybe you don't understand why I think it's important that I do these things I want to do. Can we have this conversation? So if we can't even have a conversation about these things with our manager, then we don't even have a positive work relationship to build off of, I'm afraid.
Thanks. The next couple questions I have are around trust and building trust. One of the three things you talked about. What kind of online dynamics do you think, or remote work dynamics, might be best for building trust while building strong and welcoming relationships between employees and employers? So I'll let you respond to that one first.
Well, of course, structure. We want to reduce uncertainty. So structure, predictability, frequent one-on-ones, lots of communication, the same things that, the same kind of advice you'll find if you just Google this on the internet. This kind of advice has been floating around all for the last year. All these things are going to help. It's just that there's a reason why that they're going to help. So they're going to help because they help us to build trust. That that regularity, that structure, that predictability, a strong culture. If we have norms, we clearly communicate them and we want everybody to follow them, gives us a sense of belonging, and that maybe it won't increase loyalty necessarily, but it'll increase identification and maybe help to foster positive relationships. So structure, frequency of communication, one-on-ones, baking some of that casual conversation back into the workday. Sometimes we have, it's so much more effortful to do our work remotely that we try to cut out things that are unnecessary. And I'm here to say, to evangelize, as an evangelist, that these interpersonal things are not things we can cut out. We can't go to a work mode where it's just task, 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 task.
Great advice there, Judith. And one thing I'll reflect on or ask for your reflection on is what impact all of this, sudden and forced remote work in the midst of a pandemic and great uncertainty has on the remote work environment, right? To think that this is normal, right? We're all kind of outside of normal at this point, or at least I feel like I am. How can we ensure, like, how is adapting to remote work in this time specifically different than adapting to remote work outside of a pandemic?
Well, in the old days, it was taken as canon that if you wanted to work well remotely, you needed to meet in person first. So that was the general advice that we would give. Get your team co-located, have some team building activities, let everybody get to know one another, right? So they get to know each other, they build up some trust, and then they can work effectively remotely. We can't do that anymore. But we have more tools at our disposal now. And we have a whole generation of digital natives for whom this is not a strange thing. So maybe we should be learning from our younger colleagues.
Great. On the same topic of trust is this idea of distrustful colleagues, right? Or distrustful employees, people who've withdrawn due to previous employee interactions. You commented early on about, 1 in 10 individuals in the younger workforce, the new workforce comes with trust. So 9 out of 10 don't trust naturally. How do we mentor that trust in those types of employees?
I'll just say the same thing. Structure, predictability, disclosure, time, casual conversation, getting to know somebody and demonstrating that you value them and that you're invested in them and that you're willing to help them. That's what makes us trust somebody at work. That's what will make me trust my manager. My manager has taken time to get to know me. My manager understands what I care about, what I value, what I'm motivated to do, what my constraints are, what I need. And my manager communicates frequently with me and listens to me. Those are the things that build trust in a work relationship.
Thanks for being consistent, Judith. That's great. Last question here, which is around other reading materials or sources people can consult to learn more on this topic. I know you referenced 2 books in the talk, The 10 Laws of Trust and Give and Take. Are there other reading materials or sources you would advise people to search out to learn more on this topic?
I'm a big fan of the Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review, California Management Review. Those are the journals that are aimed at practitioners, but they are full of evidence-based practice and the translation of academic research into practice. So I will always recommend those.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for taking these questions and for chatting through some of what the community brought. We really appreciate all of your great insights today, Professor White. Thank you as well to all of our participants who joined us today for bringing your great questions to the table. We hope you gained some valuable knowledge and we hope you'll join us again. You should see a poll on your screen and I invite you to let us know if you'd like to hear about events in the future. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, April 22nd, during which Associate Dean Brooke Elliott will host Professor Alana Redstone for a moderated discussion on creating a workplace climate that welcomes diverse perspectives. We look forward to seeing you then and wish you well in the meantime. Thanks again, Judith, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.